Hi everyone, I'm Kat from QuickKnee.com. Today we're going to be learning about seam allowances. We're going to discuss what exactly they are, which is great for beginners to know. Then we're going to be talking about when and where to use them, and why we use them in such a particular way. And finally, we're going to teach you how to use them and how to get the most out of your sewing projects, and more importantly, the most out of your fabric. So what exactly is a seam allowance? Well, it is the area between the stitching line and the very edge of the fabric, or where you have cut. So looking at this piece, you can tell that this here is the stitching line, this edge here is the cutting line, and this space between the two of them is considered your seam allowance. It is very important to check what seam allowance is actually being used in your sewing patterns. Most home sewing patterns will use around 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is about 15.8 millimeters. Many sewing machines will have guides on them just to help you line up your fabric while sewing. So this is an imperial machine, as you can tell by the 1/8, 3/8 and 5/8 inch markings on my needle plate. It is possible to buy metric needle plates, and you can actually replace the needle plates to the different measurement systems through many of the manufacturers. Once you start sewing a bit more, you will become more accustomed to using the different measurement systems if that's not your primary system used in your country. So I have a bit of scrap fabric here today, which I'm going to be just demonstrating with. So if I have a sewing pattern with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you simply line your fabric up with that marking. And if I put my machine down, so the very edge of that fabric is lined up. Now normally your fabric is pinned, but because this is such a small piece, I don't need it to be pinned. And you simply press down on your press foot and sew, keeping that edge lined up constantly. You want it always to be lined up as accurately as possible. And then when you stop, pull out the fabric. So looking at this piece, you can tell that this here is the stitching line, this edge here is the cutting line, and this space between the two of them is considered your seam allowance. So why do you need your seam allowance? Well, if I tried to sew on the very edge of the fabric, there will be no spot for the needle to pierce and actually catch. As a demonstration, I've just tried to sew on the very edge of the fabric, and I pull it out. It hasn't caught. If it did catch, the fabric would just fray and the thread would come out instantly. There's no way to actually sew on the very edge. You need this spacing here, the seam allowance, to hold your fabric together. Some indie designers will commonly use about 1/2 inch of seam allowance. Commercial design studios will often minimize the amount of seam allowance that they include in their patterns so that they maximize the amount of fabric that they can use, as this reduces the cost for them. Seam allowances can range from as little as 1/4 of an inch, about 6.35 millimeters in size, all the way to several inches, depending on the purpose of the seam allowance. Not all edges on a sewing pattern have seam allowance. For example, if you're cutting a pattern on the fold of the fabric, then you will not include seam allowance there, as it'll be adding unnecessary amount of fabric. Also, you'll often have several inches of seam allowance to aid fitting. This is very common if you're fitting someone else. Some special seam finishes may also include a larger seam allowance than standards, so it's always good to know just what your seam allowances is. There are commonly different seam allowance measurements for different areas of the garment that you are creating. For example, any curved areas, such as your neckline or your arm, will often have 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. You don't always cut this seam allowance when first cutting your pattern pieces. Often you're asked to later trim your seam allowances down. Just be aware of that when you are cutting out your pattern pieces, that seam allowances may be cut down later on. It's always important to make sure that your seams are as accurate as possible while sewing. If you don't have the pieces lining up and the correct fabric seam allowance, then you may find that pieces are not lining up correctly. This can also greatly affect the fit. Some situations require you to be incredibly accurate for your seam allowances. For example, if you're sewing a multi-panelled corset, for example, fitting is very important. A few millimeters can greatly change the fit of the product. If it's supposed to be quite tight and form-fitting, like a strapless dress for example, you want to make sure that it stays form-fitting. A couple small millimeter difference in one seam may not seem like a big issue, but if you've got, say, 5 seams across the whole front of the garment, ignoring just the back of the garment, that can add up very quickly to a couple centimeters or even an inch of difference, which will result in a garment that is just way. Trimming down your seams is often important to help the garment fit better in those areas. For example, a curved seam just cannot curve nicely and fit around a curved area when there's too much fabric bulk there.